Good afternoon, Wednesday, January 14th. I'm Yumna Naufal. These are today's headlines. March 14 praises Lebanon's internal security forces after they regained full control over Rumiyah prison. Walid Jumblat declares his support for postponing the closure of the Nami landfill after a meeting with environment and finance ministers. In Yemen's Al-Qaeda branch claims responsibility for the Charlie Hebdo attacks as the magazine prints 5 million copies of its new edition. Lebanon's internal security forces has completed a plan to restore full control of the Rumiyah prison's Block B, which had been taken over by Islamist prisoners. The 9-hour operation cleared the prison of communication devices used by the Islamist inmates to coordinate further operations from inside the prison. The move was praised by the March 14 General Secretariat, who released a statement congratulating Interior Minister Nuhad Mashnout and saying the effort proved that the legitimate Lebanese security and military forces are capable of enforcing the law. A delegation of European Union ambassadors also voiced support for the raid during a meeting with Prime Minister Tamam Salam. Mario Abu Zaid, a research analyst at the Carnegie Middle East Center, said the crackdown on Islamists in the Rumiyah prison will help in the strategy of the government against terrorism.
This, I believe, will help a lot in the strategy of the government and will reduce the pressure on the government because they've showed some effectiveness. They cut most of the links between those Islamists inside the prison and those leaders of those militants outside the prison. So this is a very important action taken by the government since the beginning of the issue of the hostages. Nowadays we are under the threat of the Nusra Front. The Nusra Front is trying as much as it can to infiltrate the Lebanese territory. In order to do so, they will have to create instabilities inside the Lebanese territory. However, the Lebanese security forces should put a lot of efforts and resources in order to prevent similar attacks in the future.
Army experts have safely dismantled a 10-kilogram bomb discovered near a Lebanese army base in the northern city of Tripoli. Soldiers found that explosive device about 100 meters from an army post in Tel Dahab on the main road between Kibbi and Mashdaliya. A military statement says army experts then dismantled the detonator that was attached to a gas cylinder containing 10 kilograms of explosives. The army says an investigation has been launched into the incident, which comes only 2 days after security forces raided Lebanon's notorious Rumiyah prison and emptied out a block of suspected Islamist militants. Progressive Socialist Party leader Walid Jumblat has announced his support for the cabinet's recent decision to extend the deadline for closing the Nami landfill by 3 months. The announcement was preceded by a meeting held at his residence where the ministers of Environment and Finance explained the new plan. Jumblat had previously said he would not accept any extension to the closure of the landfill. When asked about this change in his stance towards the issue, Jumblat cited pressure by political parties and civil society. The agreement includes postponing the deadline of the Nami landfill closure to April 17th, with the possibility of another 3-month extension if necessary. And so Walid Jumblat, he's making headlines today. He's repeating calls for legalizing the cultivation of cannabis by impoverished farmers in Lebanon's eastern Bekaa Valley, with the argument that the economic development would also improve national security. He suggested that the authorities should turn towards improving security and stability in the Bekaa after this week's Rumiyah prison crackdown, stressing that it cannot be done without social and economic development. Jumblat said the attempt at growing alternative crops in the Bekaa has failed and called for the legalizing of the cultivation of hashish in the poverty-stricken area. A bench warrant has been issued against Al Jazeera journalist Faisal Qasim after he failed to show up to 2 hearings in the lawsuit filed against him for criticizing the Lebanese army. After a series of tweets where the Doha-based journalist mocked the army, alleging that its only achievements were shooting video clips with Lebanese singers Wael Kfouri, Najwa Karam, Elisa and Haifa Wahbe, along with setting fire to Syrian refugee camps, a delegation of Lebanese lawyers filed a lawsuit against Qasim for violating Articles 295 and 157 of the Lebanese Penal Code, which forbids provocation of Lebanese public opinion through indirect incitement against the army and undermining the prestige of the state and weakening national sentiment. Coming up next, Muslim leaders in the U.S. voiced their concerns over growing Islamophobia. Stay with us. Welcome back. You're watching the 4:20 o'clock news on Future Television. Satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo is printing 5 million copies of this week's issue after the initial 3 million were sold out in France within minutes. People lined up across the country to buy a copy of the latest issue of the magazine after the publication was attacked by Islamist militants last week. This week's Survivor issue features a cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad on its cover, holding a Je suis Charlie sign under the caption, "All is forgiven." American newspapers are confronting a variation of that choice, whether to republish the cover page cartoon of the new Charlie Hebdo print edition or not. The New York Times chose not to republish it, drawing criticism from some free speech advocates who called the decision cowardly in the face of a terrorist attack. The top leader of Yemen's al-Qaeda branch has claimed responsibility for last week's attack on Paris satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo, when two masked gunmen killed 12 people, including much of this weekly's editorial staff. Nasri al-Ansi, the top commander of al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, appeared in an 11-minute video posted online saying that the massacre at Charlie Hebdo was in vengeance for the Prophet. Al-Ansi says Yemen's al-Qaeda branch chose the target, laid out the plan, and financed the Charlie Hebdo operation. The al-Qaeda commander added that France belongs to the party of Satan and warned of more tragedies and terror. Concern with Islamophobia in the Western world is growing following the attacks in France and in the United States. Muslim leaders are expressing concerns about the prospect of a backlash, increased attacks, and surveillance against them.
Unfortunately, whenever an attack or a terrorist attack takes place in the US or around the world, American Muslims pay for it immediately, and sometimes it takes time, but it's felt in terms of verbal abuse from individuals, and sometimes from we see it from politicians on national television, from commentators who start to provoke anti-Muslim statements or just call for the displacement of Muslims or expelling Muslims from the US and so on. There is a trend now on social media, kill all Muslims, hashtag kill all Muslims, and it's growing. So people hide behind their screens. There is a feeling of normalization of Islamophobia. Islamophobia is becoming widespread in our society. We don't see leadership, we don't see political leadership, religious leadership or civic leadership that's willing to stand and push against hate. Hate mongering in America is becoming unfortunately accepted, and this is not a problem only to Muslims, it's a problem for us as Americans.
The United Nations is urging Nigerian authorities to quickly restore law and order in the northern eastern part of the country and create conditions which enable an investigation into mass killings of civilians in the town of Baga. United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights spokeswoman Ravina Shamdasani told reporters during a news briefing that the government must act swiftly to restore law and order while ensuring that security operations are conducted in line with international law. This comes after scores of civilians were killed in early January when the Sunni Muslim militants who are fighting to establish an Islamic state in northern Nigeria raided Baga in Borno State and a nearby military base.
We deeply deplore the vicious, ruthless attacks against civilians in the northeastern Nigerian town of Baja, where Boko Haram has reportedly been operating since the 3rd of January. While the exact details remain unclear, what appears fairly certain is that mass killings and mass forced displacement have occurred. The deliberate targeting of civilians is clearly prohibited by international law, and we are very concerned at reports that there were children and elderly people among the victims. There are wildly differing accounts of the numbers. I mean, you're going from 100 to 2,000, and we haven't been able to verify that. Well, what is clear is that eyewitnesses are saying, one eyewitness was talking about how when he was fleeing, he was tripping on bodies the whole way. So clearly, a large number of people were killed. We urge the government to act swiftly to restore law and order while ensuring that security operations are conducted in line with international law and full respect for human rights. We also urge Nigerian authorities to redouble their efforts to create conditions for an effective investigation into the incidents, with a view to establishing the facts surrounding the killings and holding the perpetrators accountable.
The United Nations gathered Libya's rival factions for talks in Geneva amid warnings they could be the last chance to halt intensifying fighting for the country's main cities and oil wealth. The North African nation has been gripped by deepening conflict since the overthrow of dictator Muammar Gaddafi in a NATO-backed uprising back in 2011, with rival governments and powerful militias battling for control. It has taken the United Nations months to get the opposing sides back to the negotiating table after a single round of talks in September. But analysts warn that the Geneva negotiations between Libya's political rivals were unlikely to have any impact on the ground unless the leaders of the warring armed groups become directly involved. The talks seek to put in place the necessary security arrangements for bringing about a total cessation of armed hostilities and secure a phased withdrawal of all armed groups from all major towns and cities. Egypt's High Court has overturned the only remaining conviction against Hosni Mubarak and ordered a retrial in his embezzlement case, opening the way for a possible release from jail for the ousted former president. Mubarak was sentenced to 3 years in prison in May for diverting public funds designated to renovate presidential palaces and using the money to upgrade family properties. His 2 sons were also given 4-year jail terms in the same case. Back in November, another court dropped charges against Mubarak for conspiring to kill protesters in the 2011 revolt that toppled him from power. Mubarak remains detained for now, but judicial sources say he could soon walk free as no convictions remain against him. Finally, the main body of the crashed AirAsia plane has been located and photographed in the Java Sea over 2 weeks after officials lost contact with the flight from Surabaya to Singapore with 162 people on board. Singapore's defense minister has posted pictures of the plane body taken by a Singaporean search robot on his Facebook page, saying the words painted on the side of the wreckage confirm the discovery. Dozens of bodies have already been found, but many of passengers and crew are thought to still be inside the plane. The plane's flight recorders or tail section have been found and brought to shore as investigators have begun analyzing the information to determine the cause of the crash. This marks the end of our bulletin for today. Now for a reminder of our top stories. March 14 praises Lebanon's internal security forces after they regained full control over Rumiyeh prison. Walid Jumblatt declares his support for postponing the closure of the Nami landfill after a meeting with environment and finance ministers. And Yemen's Al-Qaeda branch claims responsibility for the Charlie Hebdo attacks as the magazine prints 5 million copies of its new edition. This wraps up your headlines here. We'll be live again tomorrow at 4:20 for all of the latest. Yumna Naufal signing off.